Whitstran a few historical tidbits. I thought that was the best way to title this. Okay, in a place that would become Whitstran for thousands of years, the Yakima people were here, and they would have been in many different places. This is a map of the indigenous people of our area, and you can see here in Benton County we have the Yakima people, and we have a little overlap of what is now called the Umatilla, but it's actually, that would have been the ancestral lands of the Walla Walla. And as those of you who live here know, you'll find artifacts and arrowheads and things like this. So Native people were here in what would become Whitstran for tens of thousands of years. And what were they doing here? Well, Native people, the Plateau people, are going to be hunting and gathering. Salmon was a staff of life. And I've asked this to a number of people who I think know. In the old days of the Columbia River system, before it was dammed, the Yakima River undammed, there would have been plenty of salmon to go around here at Whitstran, and there would have been salmon even to be found in the Spring Creek and the Snipes Creek. Okay, the Native people are going to be leaving this place to go pick berries in the summer and early fall. They're going to be hunting game, and they're also going to be digging canvas roots. There's also going to be movement through this area of people from the east who are going across the area to get to the Simcoe Mountains and the pass that will take them to the Salado Falls. So that is a little bit about that. And they would have been living in this kind of an environment. If you look up to the Rattlesnake Hills, and especially the Rattlesnake Mountain, the Wanapum people on the other side of the mountain would send their young men to this area for their vision quest. And that's where, maybe 13 or 14 years old, you are sent with very few provisions to spend a week or more out in the wilderness, at which point you meet your animal spirit, the Wayakin, etc., etc. But they would have been moving through this kind of an environment. Now, that's going on for over 10,000 years, and all of a sudden the iron horse makes its entrance. And people who are not Native people make their entrance. So it goes back even further. In 1864, Congress approved land grants to support railroad construction from Lake Superior to Puget Sound. And the red that you see is a broad brush stroke image of the land that the railroads received. The federal government knew that to settle the West, they had to have the rails, but how were they going to pay for the railroad when there wasn't anything here? And that was taken, the solution was to give land grants to railroads, and they received millions of acres. And you can see this project is going right through where we live. So land was given years and years ago to something called the North Coast Railroad. And part of this land, Section 29 East Willamette Meridian, would become the community of Whitstran. Section 29 was purchased by James and Mary Bigham in the early 1900s. And there we have it. There's a sign that still says Bigham. It is a railroad siding. Mr. and Mrs. Bigham platted part of the northeast corner of Section 29, and of course the section has 640 acres. But they only platted part of it, and they named it the Big Town site, and I'm sure that they were hoping that it would flourish into a little community, etc., but that was not to be. In 1907, they sold the remaining part of Section 29 to Seattle real estate developer and businessman Charles J. Smith. And if you ever have a day when you have nothing else to do, Google Charles J. Smith, Seattle, Washington. He was into everything. He was a railroad guy. He was a real estate developer. He was hobnobbing with the mucky bucks of Seattle. And apparently he thought it was a good idea to buy the remaining portion of Section 29 from the Biggins. He divided the land into tracts of about 10 acres each. And, you know, when you think homesteading, standard homestead size would be 160 acres for the man, perhaps another 160 acres for the wife, so we're up to 320 acres. Well, these are much smaller tracts. And they were promoted through these milk and honey. And here's, if anybody has a Whitstran milk and honey pamphlet, I'd love to have it for the museum. But here's an example. So White Bluffs on the Columbia. Oh, and you can see churches, and you can see beautiful brick buildings, and you can see orchards, and everything's going down to the river, and it looks just fabulous, doesn't it? And the idea was, please come for a small price. You too can own your own farm. In this case, you can own 10 acres and have a nice little fruit ranch, and life will be good. Those who purchased land, though, in Section 79, they discovered rattlesnakes and bench grass and sagebrush and the promise of things to come. So the milk and honey advertising didn't really look like this, did it? And you know, when I say they found sagebrush, this is a good place to put in a little story from our friend Ralph Olson, who was a little child when his father came here. Perhaps he read a milk and honey advertisement. And Ralph said that there was no wood. It was strictly the kids, older kids especially, were setting up to gather up sagebrush and put it in a hay rack. And you had to do that every 2 or 3 days to keep your house warm, to keep the fire going. This is not from Whitstran. This is a photograph from near Grandview at about this time. But this is emblematic. This looks a whole lot like what the early pioneers of Whitstran would have been dealing with. They've got a walking plow. They've got sagebrush and sand and rocks and rattlesnakes. Anyway, all of you folks who farm, can you imagine farming like that? It makes me tired just to look at it. So, Norway. Norway is going to figure very prominently in the story of Whitstran. In 1908, a group of Norwegian immigrants purchased most of the tracts offered by Charles J. Smith. And interestingly enough, these families included the Olsons, the Thorsons, the Nelsons, the Korsnicks, the Offensbobs, the Howland, the Newgards, the Paulsons, and more. And if I missed anyone's Norwegian family, please call out. So it really became sort of a little Norwegian colony out here. Some of the families that came here had immigrated to the U.S. on the same steamship, and some had even been neighbors in the old country, so they go way, way back. And there's a picture of the Norwegians of Whitstran, and a bigger picture is over there, and after we're done, Dick and Larry can show you, there's a picture of a little tiny Ralph Olson and other people from the community that you might recognize. This is another picture. It's actually not just Norwegians from Whitstran. Dick and I talked about this quite a bit. There's actually another little group of Norwegians that were living over near the Grandview Pavement Road, but they would get together periodically. They're celebrating Norwegian Independence Day, this big picnic, and they'd all get together, and the hope was that the nice Norwegian boys would be nice Norwegian girls, and we'd all live happily ever after. And anyway, you can see there's a flag in Norway, and according to Dick and his grandfather and his father's recollection, they would get together and speak the old tongue, and they would eat the food that they had enjoyed in Scandinavia, etc. With the promise of irrigation, our early Whitstran settlers planted orchards. Everybody went out and planted an orchard because, well, the water was coming, wasn't it? But it failed to materialize. But did our Norwegian settlers give up? No, they did not. They rallied themselves, they hauled water from the river, and they managed to keep those trees alive until 1909, when Mr. Schmidt stepped up and provided an 18-inch siphon, and the Sunnyside Valley irrigation system was completed. Now, Dick and I talked about this yesterday, and I think that either your grandfather might have been one of the people who helped to complete the system so that folks would have water in 1909. But you know, we all get used to our green lawns and our green trees and our green everything, that water was so key to people's lives in the early days of our area. It was a precious commodity. Some early residents drilled wells and others dug cisterns, and you'll never believe where they got the water from the cisterns. They built them from the Sunnyside Canal or the river. And according to my information, the canal and the river water were much cleaner at that time. But everybody, I just cannot stress both the history of Whitstran, the history of Crossroads, the history of this part of the world. Water was and continues to be everything when you live in a place with 7 or 8 inches of rain a year. Those who arrived in 1908, well, they found a few homesteaders. There were people up on the Rattlesnake, and there were people living around what would become Whitstran. Now, William Bickle had staked the homestead claim near Section 29 in 1902, and he is considered Whitstran's first settler. William was one of the 16 children of Bickleton founder Charles Bickle. And interestingly enough, I found out that Charles Bickle had 16 children, but he was one of 20 children. So there must be Bickles far and young. Okay, Sam Mason staked a claim in Section 28 in 1905, and he dug the first well, and he operated an old-fashioned laundromat in his place. And you'll love this. Dick told me about this, and then I found more information in the archives. Housewives took their laundry to Mason's well. They heated water in wood stoves outdoors and conducted the family's weekly washing, standing around outside of the wood stove. Okay, the Whitstran, and it was not called the Whitstran School at that time, it was called the Valley Heights School. It welcomed its first students in 1908. When the Rosa Irrigation Project was opened for farming after World War II, Quonset huts, raise your hand if you remember the Quonset huts. Yeah. Were added to accommodate the influx of new students. And because I have Yeah, your uncle took him up there, didn't he?
One went up to Stan Roy's place, or what was Stan's dad's? Bill Roy's place.
Yeah.
Next to you guys, where you guys lived. And another one is covered up, looking like a house, but it's the Quonset is still underneath it. It's on the mile road between Dallas Corner and Prosser.
Okay. So those Quonset huts, man, they've done their job, haven't they? For a very, very long time. Okay, here's another interesting thing. Did anyone go to school in the Quonset hut? You were in the what was it like in there? What was it like?
Well, it wasn't too bad in the wintertime because we did have a heating system, but there was no AC, so in the late spring and the early fall, it get really warm in there. But, you know, we didn't know any different. That's all we knew. So we went there and you know, we tried not to pee in our pants.
Bill went to school in the house there, and he loves the story that when this school was built, they carried their desks, and of course there was just a field between the old school and where they built this one. And he was just so proud to carry his desk over and put it in a classroom. And he thought this was the most wonderful school he'd ever seen because it had actual classrooms. It wasn't just one big space.
I can tell you that's true. At the end of me being in the 5th grade, all of the kids carried the chairs and the desks and all the furniture up here. And you could see these little kids doing that. Can you imagine the outrage of that today? Yeah.
They were excited to do it.
Yeah.
They were happy to do it.
We were so thrilled to get in this new school. It had air conditioning.
Well, so my understanding is that church was conducted in this schoolhouse when school was not in session. So Sundays it would be open for church. And that's another thing that you see all over the area. There were a bunch of schools up on the Rattlesnake, in the countryside around Prosser and on the Horse Heaven, and guess what? They were a school during the week. They were at Range Hall on Saturday night. They were at church on Sunday morning. So they had multiple purposes. Yes, Dennis?
Well, and the Boy Scouts met in that old building after the new school was built. That they also had scouting events and then community get-togethers. There'd be functions down there where the community would come down.
And everybody, please know that the people here at Whitstran started their own scout troop. There was a very active troop here. Yes,
Do
Jackie?
you remember when we were in school here, and the building was still there, and one day a week there was a youth gathering, and it was religious. I remember it was called...
It's kind of like a Bible school or something.
No, they called it the Good News Club. I
Yeah.
don't remember what church sponsored it or who sponsored it, but I remember going there every week in that building.
What I recall about that is Dan Miller was running something like that at the school.
When Phil was working at Seneca, we'd have our Seneca Christmas party there in that building. You didn't remember it.
To my knowledge, okay, that was torn down in 1999. To my knowledge, the old schoolhouses in our whole big community from Rattlesnake to the Columbia River, there are 2 remaining schoolhouses. One of them is up at the Neil Ice Place, and the other one is just a few feet up from Dallas Corner where Armando Nunez lived for a long time, and that was brought from the Rattlesnake. Okay, so my information says that somebody from the State Department of Education came and inspected this situation at one point and said, "This is terrible. The school is terrible and the consequences are terrible. You simply must build a new school." And guess what? They did. And here's a picture graphic on the table that was loaned to me by the family of Curator, and it's the year that they went to the new school, and you'll see a lot of things about the new school. It was a big, big deal. So I came out a couple days ago and took a picture of the school here. It was the last day of school, and the Whitstran school continues. Rah-rah! Okay, going back again, in the early 1900s, Pioneer Road was nicknamed Coffee Pot Avenue. Coffee is an important part of Norwegian culture and cuisine. In fact, Norwegians per capita are either the first or number one or number two nation on planet Earth for coffee consumption. Now, in the early days of Whitstran, coffee pots perked atop wood stoves all along the Pioneer Road, and they were ready for family and friends and passersby. And I think this is also in an era when people got their farm work done. I think they popped into one another's houses and had coffee and something to eat. Yeah. And the windows were open during warm weather, so people traveling down Pioneer Road were treated to the tantalizing aroma of Norwegian-style coffee and pastries. And here's a Kafordatak. I don't know how that's pronounced.
That sounds pretty good.
There's a European in the house. How would I pronounce it, Henry?
You did good.
Oh, good, all right. Anyway, the oral histories we have at the museum report that the Norwegian ladies of Whitstran were fabulous cooks, and everything was made with butter and cream out of their own milk cow, and it was great. So the place we know as Whitstran has been known by several names: Valley Heights, Swede Settlement, and Whitstran. And the Prosser people called it Swede Settlement, and the erroneous belief that the people there were Swedish. But the only Swedes in the early days were Andrew Olsen, Nell Schlolen, and Henry Holzgraf was German, and Alois Dober was Swiss. Whitstran, the name, honors two retired railroad nurses who lived in the community long ago, Laura Whittaker and Mary Strangeways. And they were first cousins, and they were railroad nurses for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and the railroad named the town in their honor. Did any of you know them, or would that have been too far back? Probably too far back. The women were much admired for their neighbors, and they purchased a farm in the area in 1910. Now, here's another sort of Scandinavian sounding person. Newt Hill moved to Whitstran in 1911. He was a teacher at the school, at which time he sold greeting cards door to door to make ends meet. Well, then he ended up serving in the State House of Representatives, and then later as our 4th District Representative to Congress for 10 years. And he was the son of, you guessed it, Norwegian immigrants, Newt Hill. And some of you might have remembered Newt Hill. Did anyone remember him or know him? Okay. The Whitstran store. It was built in 1916 and is among the oldest continuously operating mercantile establishments in the entire Pacific Northwest. It has staying power, that store. My information is that the store was built by Ernest Fry. Ernest Fry was a big guy around Prosser. He was a hay broker, and he was into this and he was into that. And here's a list of the people who owned and operated it. Bar Stad was the first. S.E. Sampson was the second. J.F. Grafstein was the third. And then we have Ralph and Edith Olson. Then we go to Blake's Market and McCorkle's Market. The Elizabeth Wright Olson family. And I think that Ralph and Edie bought it in the 1950s, if I'm correct. And they had been farming before that.
1957.
57. And in my own family, my mom and dad tell stories about the Rosa, because my mom and dad were way up on the Rosa, and there was no phone service. And poor Ralph and Edie had to kind of operate a post office where people left notes at the store to communicate with people. I think it's awfully nice that they did.
Elise, anything about Curator's stores?
You know, I would like everybody to talk about Curator later. I couldn't find much information, but I think we should remember her too. Okay, here's another fellow who was, oh yes, Linda? Okay.
What was your question?
Oh, when we're done and we're remembering, let's talk about Sharita's store too.
She's my dad's cousin.
Okay, see, we're all related here. Because your Whitehead was an early orchardist and long-time member. He planted his Pioneer Road apple orchard in 1911. And in the Prosper paper from 1968, where they were doing a kind of a retrospective, it said that his apple orchard that he planted in 1911 was still producing apples in 1968. So I guess that was back in the days when you didn't just plow out the orchard. And he lived on Pioneer Road, and there he is, our gentlemanly Edgar.
You made good apple cider.
Yes, yes. Raise your hand if you bought apple cider from Edgar.
We even helped him make cider.
And how you make it, yeah. And here's his house on Pioneer Road. Other names and images to encourage discussion. Now, what's this picture of Norway doing in here? This is a picture of farmland in a fjord in Norway. And I have discovered that only 3% of the ground in Norway is farmable. 3%. So you can see why Norwegian people were eager to come to the United States and farm, and it's called primogeniture. And that's a system in which you have limited land or you have an estate, and it's an old tradition in which the whole thing goes to the oldest boy. And everybody else goes and finds something else to do. Well, think about that. That's happening all over Scandinavia. That's happening all over Europe. No wonder people were eager to come and get this railroad property. There's another Norwegian term called Oldenstrat, and that is this applied to a farm, and it is still practiced in Norway because the farms are there's so little farmland to go around. So, now I took a picture of this, and I'm going to just embarrass myself. I've lived here all my life. What is this, everybody?
That's the old lumber.
Tumulum Lumber
It's
Company.
the old Tumulum, okay.
And Elise, when I was a young boy, they had a pipe bench across the street on the end of that store, and the farmers that had to make these hundreds and hundreds of pipe nipples for their concrete line would come down there and use that vise and maybe Brother Olson's pipe cutter, and that's where they made their pipes.
Huh.
Yeah, right there outside.
They sold you the pie. It was good for us.
I remember cutting the pipe. We had several different sizes of pipe, and I remember cutting the pipe and then threading it. And Dad had a bunch of fittings to go along with it too, so people could plumb their houses with those pipes. And then we got PVC pipe upscale later.
Mine and I've never heard so people sat outside in kind of a community setting and got their pipes ready.
You know, it's almost like a little hardware store over there.
Yeah.
And, you know, apparently they were selling, you know, they were serving the needs of all these guys trying to get water. And I distinctly remember going down with my dad, seeing him crank that old die, one after another after another.
So if I went into this building right now, what's inside?
It's housing.
It's housing, yeah.
It's housing.
It's ours. Yeah.
So this leads to one of my favorite characters of Prosper, a beloved character, Clara Carragher. Does anyone have Mrs. Carragher's story? She was the principal and a teacher here for
A
years.
fourth grade teacher.
Yes.
Yep. Well,
Yeah.
she was still teaching fourth grade when I was there.
Oh my God.
Many years after Dick was there.
What I remember about her was she had an accent.
Mhm.
And when we were doing spelling, and she would pronounce the words and we had to spell them, and she said, "purr."
Yes.
The purr boy. So it wasn't purr like a cat, it was poor. Yeah, she had a distinct accent.
She also had a finger that didn't collapse. So she was like this.
I've got a couple of little stories about her. I think they came from the South, and so
Yeah, they
she taught us a lot of songs to sing, like Cantown Races and
Dixie.
Huh?
Dixie. Dixie.
Dixie, yeah, Dixie. And she also was the best teacher that I think that we probably had during the 6 years that we were in school. But she was pretty firm in her discipline. And back then, it was okay for the teachers to discipline kids. And when the boys got out of line, she would grab them by the ear and drag them down the hall to the principal's office. Of course, that would never happen nowadays.
So her daughter Barbara married a fellow named Shad Hope. And Shad Hope's daughter Stephanie reached out to me and said, I'm going to have Dad bring Grandma's scrapbook, the 1953-54 Whitstran PTA scrapbook. And then Shad came in and talked to me. And I said, where'd she come from? And he said, she came from Oklahoma. And she said, I think things back in Oklahoma were pretty rough, and some member of her family got a job at Hanford, or maybe working on a dam, and she and her husband followed them here, and they bought the farm. And she had no intention of teaching school, but there were so few school teachers that they just almost begged her to come to Whitstran. And she said, but I only have 2 years of college. And whoever was in charge said, oh, Fiddly Dee, come on in, Claire, and run to school. And then she had to get her credentials during the summer. So she was from Oklahoma. Now, maybe her family had been from further southeast before that. I don't know. So, Tumalum Lumber. Now, Tumalum Lumber was the creation of Willard Blake, was it not? Who owned the Tumalum Lumber Company?
Well, that building that you had is the building that still sits on the corner there.
Mhm.
I think Tumalum Lumber preceded Willard Blake. I'm not sure about
Yeah,
that.
yes,
But,
Okay, so maybe,
and they sold a lot of lumber for people that were building houses in the area. And then I think Tumalum Lumber went out of business, and it just became part of the Whitstran store. And it was, like Mike said, it was used for hardware and supplies for the store. So that's what I know.
Tumalum Lumber Company was they had stores all over the United States. So it was just one of it. I don't know that it was owned by anybody that we know.
all right.
Yeah.
So here is Does anybody remember these happy days?
Oh, yeah.
I remember those days.
So potatoes were grown in Whitstran before the Rosa, but the Rosa project brought tremendous amounts of potato production. And somebody told me, who told somebody else, or heard it from somebody else, that Whitstran at one time had lots of potato sorting and packing sheds. Does anyone want to guess maybe how many?
I've heard 8.
Right. And so, of course, Willard Blake had one. Who else had potato warehouses here?
O'Brien.
George and Brian.
I know there's a room, there was like 8 packing sheds along the river.
Right.
I think that came from Buzz Blake. I'm not sure. Whose pictures ran from this?
Well, actually, I swiped that. That title of that is Digging Spuds near Grandview, but it was the closest I could get. But I'm sure it looked a whole lot like Digging Spuds near Whitstran.
Well, Mike and I were talking about it. Remember the guys also dragging their spuds between their legs, filled that bag, and throw them up on the truck, bring them down to Whitstran, and we stood right over there watched them plant potatoes.
So you'd have a big canvas belt around your waist.
Yeah.
And there'd be a big hook.
Yep.
Big hook on, maybe on both sides. I remember.
It's both
on the
sides,
right-hand
both
side.
sides.
And then you had a board frame that you took a bag off your hook and you hooked it on the bag. And then you picked up potatoes like this. And it was,
Yes, we did it.
Yeah.
Gary did it.
My uncle, Odie Bennett, was the fastest sax solo.
Yep.
He won a contest, didn't he? Every 3 seconds. And he had a guy that, you know, what do you know?
They
The
got
children,
pictures-
yeah.
they got
And Uncle Odie would
pictures
sew
of
him up.
And his
But, yeah.
hands were blurred, so his back, his
Yeah.
hands are literally.
He was fast and he was good. And Willard Blake used to have a spud warehouse right across the way here. And my folks would work there and then I would go over after school and work also. So, but I'm pretty old, so I'm so scared.
I remember, it seemed like they were called swampers or something.
It's exactly what they were called.
Yeah.
You bring your truck in, there was a bag, you just stacked on the truck. I mean, there's no
Yeah.
container.
I asked Willard Blake for a job, and he said, "I don't think you're big enough to cut the mustard." I said, "Give me a try." And then my job was to unload those, about 60 pounds, to unload those spud sacks. They went through the sorter. Your dad was also a sewer. And he was real good too. The two brothers, boy, they had those 150-pound sacks of spuds, and then we threw them up into the rail cars. Remember that?
Yeah. I tried to sew sacks one time, and I went fine until I got the needle stuck in my thumb. That's enough of it.
The spud warehouses hired a lot of people in the community, housewives, kids, or not kids, but maybe my mom worked in one.
So here's the story my mom, Loretta Coupons, told me. She said that she and my dad hadn't been married too long. Maybe they just moved up to Case Road. And she said, "Gaylord, my dear, I would like an electric mixer." And he said, "You don't need an electric mixer. My sister has one and she doesn't use it. My mother has one and she doesn't use it. You don't need an electric mixer." And it made her so mad that she got a job sorting spuds until she raised enough money to buy an electric mixer. Yeah.
And here's another thing on picking up the potatoes. I can remember like Mrs. DeLon, who was a Mexican lady about this tall. She'd work all day long and she'd pick those potatoes and pull those butts. It wasn't men, it was women and children and everybody.
sacks off the trucks, and Dick talked about doing it, but I tried it for a while, but I lasted about one day, and I wasn't big enough to do that. You dump those sacks, you dump the sack in there, and then you pull the sack out and empty the spuds out, and they were always a handful of rocks and lots of dirt clods that were mixed in with the potatoes, and the sorters had to try to get that stuff out of there, and the potatoes went over a belt and they got washed and cleaned, and they were in surprisingly good shape by the time they got to the Bennett brothers, who were
Okay, I have a question about the Bennetts. Somebody told me, and I don't know how this works, but is it true that the Bennetts and the Cohens and Judkins and the somebody are all related in Whitstran? How does that work? I'll give you the microphone.
I didn't understand what you said.
How are these people represent a really big group, an extended family in Whitstran, and how are you all related?
There was Gary's dad, Harry, my dad, Toby, and Uncle Odie, Bennett, were all brothers from here. And then Hazel, their sister, was married to Clarence Yaney, where that comes from. The Yaneys, Aunt Sissy, the daughter, married
Irvin Cohen.
So that's where that comes in. And then Judkins was, they're related, but I'm trying to figure out how they were a sister married a sister, and your brothers, that's how it came about. We were all this area.
And you and Gary are first cousins, but you were raised together, right?
Yeah.
Gary and I, yes. We
lived down by down close to the river, and we used to tell people we lived down under the hill, and so we wondered, did they think we lived in caves?
Well, we almost did. The houses were very nice. No running water, no electricity, and you were talking about the cleanliness of the canal and the river and stuff. I bet probably Gary and I both have drank water out of the Yakima River, because
back then the river was just as clear as could be. I'm sure we drank out of the river.
That was I was born in 35, so that, and I lived down there, so it's an interesting life.
To add to Esther's story, the Judkins also were related to the Kleinos too, that lived here.
To the who?
Kleinos.
Oh,
Bob Kleino and his wife lived just right down the road here. But
I wanted to say something about Swin Sampson.
Oh.
Swin, he was a nice fellow.
And again, Swin Sampson was the guy who ran the store.
Yeah.
And there was a sign up that said, in Swin we trust, all others must pay cash.
Anyway, Swin, at the time I was going to school, I think the last part of the place up north of McCready Road was not much up there. But anyway, Swin called the people that the kids that went to school up on. They were the hillbillies. And of course, Esther and I, we lived down by the river, and we were called the river rats.
Oh, thank you. Okay, here's a few other things that might elicit some good conversation. Willard Place. In my research, Willard I think that well after Mason, many owners maybe came into the possession of Willard Blake, and it was a good enough well that it provided water to 5 or 6 other houses. And of course, Willard is the father of Buzz, right?
Buzz.
And who were the other children in that family?
Pat Blake graduated with Bill.
Okay.
And he was a fixture at the Whitstran store.
Yeah.
If you went in there, you were going to get to visit with Willard Blake, and I will remember this my entire life. I went in there one time, these guys went fishing in Alaska, so I don't know where they went fishing. They had a salmon in the ice cream case down there. Joe and Mrs. Grimes, or who was the lady that worked there?
Yeah.
Florence Grimes.
Florence Grimes.
Yeah, Florence. You open up the ice cream case, they're all standing around admiring their big. It's like this big. I'll never, ever forget that. Ever.
We used to consider him the mayor of Whitstran.
Oh, yeah. So everybody, what the heck are these ugly things?
Yeah, sugar beets.
So I have heard stories about the big giant pile of sugar beets at Whitstran. Tell me more about it.
Weren't they right across from the school? From the school, I remember that.
No, they're on Pioneer Road. Just between the railroad tracks.
Okay, up by Simplot up there?
No. There's just go to the end of Pioneer Road and
Right along
yeah.
the
There was a big, they called it the beet dump.
Yeah.
They called it the beet dump. And the farmers used to haul their beets down there and they would dump them. The trucks coming off the hill from the farmers that grew those sugar beets, and a lot of those old trucks were kind of rattle traps, and they would come hauling ass down the road, and sometimes you better get off to the side of the road because the sugar beet would come flying off the back of those trucks, and those sugar beets, some of them weighed up to 20 pounds. They were very impressive.
And usually hunting season was on during that time, so there was always a shotgun in the truck too. Just in case yourself hasn't.
Yeah.
So
Another thing in my memory is that they didn't just have one pile of beets. They had a huge pile of beets, and to me as a kid, they looked like they're a quarter mile long.
Yes, yeah, they're about quarter mile long.
And I think those beets got loaded on rail cars and taken up to the
The old beet dump that we're all talking about was on Cap Humlin's ground. You showed him a picture, or his name up there. He had been a seagoing captain of four-masted sailing ships.
Yeah, I read about that. So there was an old sailor in town.
Yeah. My dad knew him. Our dad.
Horace Hamilton. Horace Hamilton went to the Whitstran School, and Horace Hamilton paid attention, and Horace Hamilton became a judge for the Washington State Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting. Spring Creek, any Spring Creek memories?
Fishing.
And you caught some.
We were little kids and we'd get a bobber and maybe some red eggs over at the store, and they'd have them along the back behind the store.
They released it.
They released them, yeah. And a lot of kids got their first fish there.
Was it kind of like a kid's fishing day kind of a deal, or?
Kids, there's his own farmer.
Who do you suppose put the fish in there?
I think the game department.
Yeah.
Hi, we bought the Corsics place back in 2017.
Uh-huh.
We're always,
It's right on the Spring Creek.
yeah, and he always goes up to the little bridge there. And he sees, he'll see fish in there that way.
Yeah.
Brown trout.
Cool.
Delicious.
Under police was the fishing.
Right, I mean,
And it goes go back up to where it starts, there's brown trout all the way up there.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, they used to put about 5,000 little rainbows in the creek, and it was supposed to be for kids only, but.
Right.
Well, you know, one thing that stands out is right north of the Whitstran store, the creek came underneath the road, and it was really kind of a nice grassy bank there with big trees and all that. And all us kids would go down there, like Jeff said, with their eggs and our bobbers, and you know, it was a hoot, really. We fished underneath the railroad trestle further down, and catch them out of there too.
That's right, that's right. The trellis.
Yeah.
And of course, Spring Creek is coming to you from the side of the Rattlesnake Mountains. That's where it comes from, correct?
Yep.
It starts up there on Gap Road, I think, the north end of Gap Road.
Okay, is this the Dover barn?
Yes.
Yeah. And tell me, or anybody who wants to, tell me more about the Dover barn. And Dick, isn't this where Andy Anderson did the rocker, or was that Andy Olson? Andy Anderson?
Yeah.
Andy Olson was a rock mason.
Now, what is this, an old milking barn or something?
No,
that's
it. Go ahead.
That's an apple storage building.
Storage.
The walls,
Apple
the stone walls are 18 inches thick.
And I don't care how hot it was in the summer, you could walk into that building and it was cool. It was amazing, yeah.
And the upstairs wood part of that is where they would pack the apples. They'd store the apples down below, and then they would take and go up and they'd pack up there.
Packing line.
And Edgar Whitehead, part of what he did when he was first in this area was he ran packing crew, and he'd take this crew around to different growers who had their storage sheds on their places, and he would pack their fruit for them.
Didn't your parents own that place?
Yes,
Yeah.
we did, yes. Yeah, that was.
He made real good apple cider.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll tell you about that sometime.
If the apple was only half rotten, that was good.
Yeah, I know,
If
they
it's
were
more
good.
than that,
Put
just
it in
leave it.
there.
And the bird droppings, you run your hand over it 3 times, and what stayed on the apple, that was okay.
Yeah,
It fortified our immune system.
yes.
Well, and if you let the apple cider sit very long, it'd get hard on you.
Just north of the store over on Rough Rock, there's an old ranch there, I believe it was in the Hill family, as a sheep ranch.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of history in our town.
That would have been the Harlanville family.
No, that's cousin. That's cousin.
I remember Paul.
Paul Hill.
A lot of history there. A lot of history.
So the big fabulous rock foundation, it's not really a foundation, it's more than a foundation. Dick told me that Andy Olson was the Swede in town, and he was trained as a stonemason in Scandinavia in a Swedish style. So that when we look at this barn, it's actually reflecting a little piece of Scandinavia that made it all the way to Whitstran. Isn't that neat? And Andy Olson, do you remember the big giant fireplace in the Prosser City Park?
Yeah.
Andy Olson made it. And he